Welcome everyone to the October webinar for the TELedvisors Network. I'm Colin Simpson, one of the conveners of this organisation. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from lands of the people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today. Our session today is a little unusual. We have Hans Tilstra from Keypath Education who came to us with the idea to start work, at least. If we can knock this off in an hour, I'll be very impressed, on developing a taxonomy of assessment. So I might actually hand over to Hans now, and I think it should be an interesting session.
Great. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, excellent. All right, I will share my screen. Share my screen. All right, so now I did put the link to the Sway. Here we go. All right, can we all see my screen?
Not yet. Oh, yeah, there we go.
It's coming up now.
Excellent. Okay. So what I was hoping for is to draw on the wisdom of 25 people. I'm always curious when I go to these TEL webinars what sort of knowledge all these we all have, and to what extent we might be able to share some of that insight. And so my name is Hans Tilstra. I'm a learning designer at Keypath Australia, and in a fortnight I'll be called a curriculum advisor. And so what I'm hoping for is to spend some time on giving you a context of a problem I think that needs solving. Then go to a Google Sheet and see if we can contribute to a fine-tuning of types of assessment as an example of knowledge management. And I'm wondering what a collaborative attempt might reveal in terms of is there an elegant simplicity underpinning long lists of assessment types. I was asking myself whether or not this had anything to do with TEL, and my view is that in our work we need to be good at knowledge management. And one way that technology can assist us is in developing lists of controlled data, to have a menu-driven approach to curriculum management rather than what I call Micronesia, where we all inhabit these individual islands, and whilst we're masters of our domain, we create an enormous amount of variability within individual courses, and that doesn't always assist with constructive alignment. So what I would like to do is, at some point this workshop gets a little bit messy inherently. It's a bit muddy sometimes when you're in the middle, and I'm wondering what our insights are in terms of what are some tensions and trade-offs that we face when we endeavor to streamline and create an elegant taxonomy of assessment types. And my ideal is that at some point the gestalts emerge. So what are some patterns that might emerge that might justify having a simpler list of assessment types? So those are my ambitions, and that's what I'm hoping you'll keep in the back of your mind in terms of why it will be worthwhile to contribute to this discussion and the thoughts. So what is the setting? Let's take a moment to reflect on the challenges of curriculum design. This is a painting by Jackson Pollock, and that depicts my experiences of working in VET, in training packages, but also in complex, large organizations in which there are a lot of competing demands. So I would predict that many learning designers at some point will have been tasked with the challenges of constructive alignment. And there are many things to align. So many universities have their own graduate attributes, 7, 8 or so. Sometimes we draw on some global initiatives to create some common standards. Sophia 8 is an example in IT. Some programs need to align to accrediting bodies. So you've got the health cluster under APRA. Engineers Australia, it's got its competency standards. The Australian Computer Society seems to draw on Bloom, and then you need to somehow evidence as well how your learning outcomes align to Bloom. At some point, we needed to have a look at the AQF learning outcome descriptors. I'm not sure to what extent that's still figural for people. Just want to mention that many accrediting bodies, many degrees still draw on the threshold learning outcome project that is now about 9-10 years old, but certainly the deans of science have still drawn on them, and there's still uses for that in the business realm. Universities will have their own course learning, subject learning outcomes, study tasks, like what do you want me to do, what are the design patterns, and then assessment types and dimensions. So I don't aim to look at, I propose looking at the assessment types as an example of knowledge management, an example on how you might grapple with the complexities of this without resorting to enormous spreadsheets. So what are some of the challenges? Inherently, in curriculum, you're dealing with competing demands. And so the term curriculum often is associated with it being contested and crowded. As a result, it can be tempting to just accommodate everything. So if a vice chancellor says, I want grit as part of a graduate attribute, add grit. You're not going to argue with someone more senior. If a stakeholder says, I need to add 21st century skills, lo and behold, why don't we bolt on yet another list that we need to grapple with? But the question remains then in this curriculum space, if you take on this approach where you offer something for everyone and you add to the list and you never cull, who are you serving? Are you serving the students with these long, impressive lists? And when you say you're mapping, are you mapping or are you listing? We often use the word mapping quite freely, but I wonder to what extent we map rather than list. So that brings me to a tweet that I screen grabbed because I thought it was it resonated with me. And that's about a tension between hoarding and Marie Kondo. So how do we reconcile these? What is there to learn from hoarding versus Marie Kondo? Can we come to a clean, elegant, simple categorization that may work for us? Now, that might seem a little bit simplistic, but there is something there about thoughtful categorization that when we use the term taxonomy that comes from the discipline of biology, and it can also be described as a work in categorization of our knowledge, categorization of our learning outcomes, categorization of our graduate attributes, our 21st century skills, our learning tasks, and also our assessments. So just 2 points I want to make in terms of the notion of hoarding and what to deal with that. So the first one is this study by Wincy, who studied hoarding, and what they noticed was that hoarders are not very good at categorization. They have too many categories. And by retaining too many categories, you lose the ability to organize items. And I think this plays out in universities as well. So I do find sometimes that you work with an academic and they might say, look, lovely Hans, that might apply in that discipline, but my discipline's different. In my discipline, we need to have these assessment types. And so that's the notion of how many categories should you aim for. And then the second point is one that I also find worth highlighting, and that's observation by Faustin Miner, who said that if you don't have a theory, if you're atheoretical, your number of categories proliferate. And that second point that Faustin Miner make, I come across that not only in curriculum design, but also when we have a new way of working together. You know, we'll have Slack or OneNote or SharePoint and Jira, and they all promise to be so, now we'll be really organized. Now we'll be able to find stuff. And I wonder to what extent this occurs when you approach that in a non-theoretical way. So when we develop taxonomies, what we're looking for is what's called construct validity. And so what does construct validity look like? It means that when you categorize something, that there's a widespread agreement about that's where something should be. So when you group something, the academic goes, yeah, this is the type of assessment that it is, and there's an agreement about it. And if there's no agreement about this, then I think we're still in more of a Venn diagram than in a set of drawers. So construct validity, when you go to an Airbnb and you go, where do I expect the cutlery? Then there's a construct validity when you expect that drawer somewhere near the sink. And in universities, what we're looking for is a widespread agreement about where you expect particular assessment or other constructs to be. So here's what I propose we do. I would like to do an exercise in a co-authoring exercise where I invite you to, if you can have access to this, and let me see if I can share the link.
Done that.
Done that, excellent. So if you, let's see, we've done this testing. It looks like people are able to get into the spreadsheet. That's excellent. So here's one I prepared earlier. So what I've brought together here is some ways of classifying and making sense of tagging assessment types. And what I'm looking for is kind of the wisdom of crowds. So in column A, I've got some suggested assessments. And I'm wondering whether you look at that and go, well, this is missing. This is another assessment I would add to the list. And then if you could categorize that that assessment and say, well, what's the time span on that assessment? So if you've got an e-portfolio, that would be, I would classify that as a cumulative. But you might be an expert on e-portfolios and say, no, it's at the end. The second thing is what kind of assessment is it? And so I'm using the Stodberg type to he argued that there were 5 different types of assessment. It's either an open question, a discussion, a portfolio, or a closed question. And so excellent, yes, this is starting. Now, if you add an abbreviation, would you mind spelling it out? Because I think that would be quite helpful as well. So Beetham and Sharp, I've found quite interesting as well. They categorize pedagogy in 4 different types. And so if you hover over the cell, you can get the definition, just in case you're wondering about the difference between an associative, constructive, individual, and situative. The other lens that I think I can take to assessment is the work that Ian Palmer. So this is I think this is a piece of work from Deakin, where they advanced the level of authenticity and proximity of an assessment task. And if you hover over cell E1, it'll give you the definition. Okay.
Just to step in for a second, Hans, we're getting a couple of questions in the chat of people. I was just wondering if you could maybe take us through the different columns and just sort of speak to what kind of information you're sort of looking for. Some of these models I'm familiar with, some of them I'm not.
Yeah. So I'll give you so for example, so if you look at the time span one, let me sequence them. So if we rank first by, let's go to time span to A to Z. So if I go to column B, I'm looking at particular types of assessments seem to be accumulative, that they're not that you're expected to keep adding to the e-portfolio over a particular time span. That a practicum is likely to be assessed during the practicum, but the exam is traditionally at the end, typically. And so if you
Hans, is that the same as, so is that the equivalent to formative and summative assessment?
Yes, no, that's an interesting, that's a dimension that I haven't added here to try and help anchor the discussion about a taxonomy. I would, we could add so one of the things you could do, if you can think of a dimension that might add, so here, for example, if we say, well, one of the differentiators between types of assessment is formative, summative. So for example, let's use the example where you add a particular vantage point on assessments. I would think that all of them end up being summative.
And if I may respectfully argue the opposing view, everything is formative. It should always be making you better. It should always be giving you feedback as a learner.
Yep.
Very respectfully, Hans. Sorry, it's Cheryl.
No. What I'm hoping for is here not is grappling, because I think that if we want to have a what I feel I'm presenting here is a grand design, like an idealistic ideal of a beautiful house, but the stage of this process of grappling with dimensionality is what I experience as winter, where the beautiful idea encounters challenges. And what are those challenges? I would think that an exam would not be experienced by a student as formative, but
Bruce just put something in the chat, Hans, about a comment that a lot of times there will be overlap of assessments, like a logbook during a practicum or a reflection on a group project, and so they might be merged. How would we deal with that?
I'm hoping for mergers. And this is part of the idea that often we end up with a Venn diagram. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to differentiate. So I mean, sometimes, and I think I skipped over this during the briefing, but there are some examples where we become very good at simplifying. And a classic example of that would be the Big Five. So the Big Five personality theory emerged from hundreds of different ways of looking at a phenomenon. And by doing a cluster analysis, it distilled it into the essence of being 5 personality types. And I wonder whether something similar could occur here, where through grappling with this, we come up with maybe not 5 or 7. I think that's ambitious. But I'm also looking for the counter arguments. Like, what are discipline-specific assessments that cannot be generalizable through that you can't make applicable to another discipline.
So like the OSCE that's in there now, objective structured clinical examination.
Hank, you say OSCE.
But that's just a
OSCE.
demonstration of skill. I would argue that an OSCE and a practicum possibly reduce down to the same thing, and that's a skill demonstration, which could also be a speech or a presentation or a group project. You've demonstrated some type of skill, and therefore they all get compressed down into that. And then you have to write something, and so that's like a short answer question or an essay or a report.
So this is at the core of what you'd group it with. So row 24 is on its own at the moment. But would it be sufficiently similar to another category? See, what I think we're replicating here is the challenges that a committee will have, where it will be tempting to keep the categories separate, even though they could be merged into one. And then the key question is, what could that be? So so OSCE would be an example, but not a type on its own. So in the practicum, is an OSCE an example of a practicum type of assessment?
I would argue it depends on what you mean by practicum. Is a practicum actually the go and spend 6 weeks on placement? Or is the practicum complete this task and let me watch you?
So if you would call it a practicum task, is that a helpful construct, or does it muddy the waters?
Can you give me an example of what that means?
It would be let me classify it. I would classify it as a situative task, an observed activity that the student that is assessed by someone in the workplace. So high authenticity level, high proximity level, but then what are we going to call it that will be widely understood? So maybe a practicum task then is not a helpful way of construing it. How would you construe it?
It's interesting, Hans, because Rosie said earlier in the chat, I would like to argue that the first column is task, not type, which I think is an interesting argument. Rosie, if you're there, did you want to explain that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, great. So I've actually worked on this at Monash for a while, and we've gone round and round in circles with a lot of these same conversations, because ultimately assessment the way that we've looked at it is particularly in different disciplines. Something like an essay is actually quite different. It's actually used quite differently. And the purpose of that essay could be very different. You could have an analytic essay, you could have a reflective essay, and they're actually really different assessment tasks in terms of what you're asking the students to elicit. And so I guess my argument would be, sort of as we've been looking through the taxonomies that we've been trying to create, that all of the things down that left-hand side, they're actually either a product or a task. In actual fact, and when you're looking at the type of assessment, perhaps that's where you might look at your formative, summative or diagnostic as being the type, or you could even look at that as the purpose of the assessment. Dylan William has some really great work around assessment purpose, and you know how the decisions that we make around assessment really need to be about the evidence that we're trying to gather. And I think often in higher ed, that's something that we forget. We get quite caught up in traditions, we get quite caught up in discipline standards and signature pedagogies, and that a lot of the innovation I think that we need to work through is reconsidering what evidence we're trying to elicit from the students. So one of the things that we used at Monash that might be helpful is the framework there. I put a link in Thomas et al. And so we started to use that to try and do our own taxonomy, I suppose, because we found that, an essay, I would also argue an exam is not an assessment type. That is the way you conduct an assessment under exam conditions. It's not a task in itself. You might do an essay under exam conditions or a case study under exam conditions. And I think the flexibility is just so diverse. It's really hard to come up with concrete categories, which, that's all.
Good. So what did you end up coming up with? What was the outcome of all that work?
So we've sort of done a whole lot of decision-making things. So a lot of these columns here that you have are decisions, I think. Mm-hmm. Who's assessing, is there self-assessment or reflective assessment? But I actually put further up, I'll find it again, there's the Monash quick assessment tasks quick start. So you'll see we've actually called the left-hand column, we've said that they're assessment tasks, and we've categorized the assessment tasks into types according to the purpose, and it's that Thomas et al. Link, the framework. I did try several times, couldn't come up with a better framework than what they had come up with, so decided to go with it. It was a lot easier.
I just saw
showing that reference in the reference tab. I've just wondering whether there might be another co-authoring benefit, is that, so I've shared some references that I found quite helpful, but certainly not a complete set. But if we work through the assessment task versus the assessment type, then what you're suggesting is that an e-portfolio is a task, but not a type.
Yes, I would argue that that could be in terms of the type of assessment. It might be a formative assessment, perhaps, or it could be summative, depending on what you're doing with the evidence that you're gathering. It could be a mixture of formative and summative. There might be a diagnostic element in there if you're using it to assess and to drive your own teaching in terms of the learning that's happening. And the tasks within that e-portfolio, you could be asking students to do analytical tasks, reflective tasks, creative tasks. There's sort of a plethora of different things that could be happening.
It almost seems like if you're differentiating between an assessment task and an assessment purpose, now I was intrigued by your different types of essays. So if we use that as an example, we've got a reflective essay, an analytic essay. I've come across these before, and I do still wonder.
Expository, a research essay, like there's,
I always did the New Scientist essay.
Would that be a publication though? Or an article?
New Scientist style.
Yeah, and so I would say that they're the parameters that the student needs to meet, like stylistically. Like I think we all have this innate idea in our head of what an essay should look like, depending on what discipline we've come from, what we've done in the past. And one of the issues we have is that students don't know that, especially double degree students. They're not going to know every individual academic, like their own mental conception of what an essay should look like, and we're not very good at articulating that for students. And so in terms of a taxonomy, that's where we've sort of gone with that, the Thomas More one, the framework where students should know that a persuasive essay is going to look very different to a research essay in terms of the language, the conventions, and all of that as well.
It still strikes me that the types of even if you call them assessment tasks, which I think is an intriguing direction, that they can be clustered, that there is a degree of grouping possible, and that there's a bit of a sense of and that we're going to the core of what's really hard about this. It sounds still tempting to go for a great deal of variation when and to what extent is, for example, let's look at row 11 and 12, a reflective essay and an analytic essay. They are both open question. They are presumably post. Normally I find essays are positioned, they're summative. They're normally, I would say, a constructive individual. Authenticity, proximity level, so the extent to which they, I would say an essay, maybe there's a difference there. So perhaps a reflective essay could be based on practice, so it could be medium to high. In this example, could they still be subheaded under a heading of essay? Or do you think they are so different that they need to be given their own category?
Could you make it a bigger category by calling it writing or a written response?
So we spent some time on mode as well, yeah. I mean, you could actually have a spoken essay if you want. There's nothing to stop you doing that. It's not common.
Mode. So mode is written. A reflection piece is written. Does that give us a handle? A logbook? Are those helpful categories that come to the clustering? So if all the ways of tagging column A, which ones do you think hold value and which ones are missing?
Who is using it? If it is for learning designers, if it is for people doing the design work without the discipline knowledge, the priorities are different. If we take a student perspective on it, actually they probably care about the time commitment, which is defined by other parameters. And so I think it depends on who's it being prepared for.
I would suspect that students will have a plain English version of a description of an assessment, but the aim here
that's a big assumption, Hans.
Yeah, who is it for student? Because the student can't just be told what an essay is, because the conventions change. But a staff member might be told of how to convey what an essay is to students to help them meet those conventions. I think universality is very difficult with all the different specifics for a discipline.
So if you look at column A, which ones would you greenlight as being universally understood? and which ones would you for example, I think an e-portfolio is a reasonably clear, I'm not sure. I wonder about the difference between a reflective essay and an essay. So to me, an essay is inherently reflective, or I would presume that that's just a quality of the essay. And I would presume that there's an analytic component in an essay. So what would be the rationale of splitting the essay into types of essays?
I mean, if we're talking about a taxonomy, then the types of essays just sit at a level below essay. So that all sort of makes sense, which suggests to me that the work that we're doing here is all still contributing. It's just a matter of working out which bits go into which levels.
Yeah.
And what the purpose of the levels are, I guess, which does come back to comments that other people have made.
Yeah.
I mean, is this tying to learning outcomes? Is it tying to learning practices, teaching practices? Who's it for?
I think one of the drivers of streamlining and developing menus is to head towards a managed curriculum, to make curriculum more modular and more manageable on scale, and to make it easier for a learning designer who's tasked with constructive alignment to look at how the piece of work in one unit or subject relates to the larger degree. And often I find that the longest list of assessment types has emerged in contexts where there's a great deal of a respect for academic autonomy, but not so much attention paid to the manageability of a whole degree or a cluster of degrees. And that's where I think there's a tension in how far do you go in streamlining, and what do you lose when you say it's an essay versus and which disciplines really have the very distinct assessments. So an example could be that some industries are regulated. So we've got a profession, a nurse, and it's regulated what types of nurses there are. But in psychotherapy, it's unregulated. So if you decide to come up with your own type of psychotherapy, you're welcome to. And so what you see is a proliferation of categorizations. And you see very innovative and very creative ways of differentiating, but also exaggerating differences.
And that relates to discipline-specific ideas around communication and assessment. Tom made a point earlier in that assignment tasks aren't always written in plain English, because they sometimes have to be written in the language of a discipline. And so, so interpreting an assignment tasks in some disciplines might be part of the learning process itself.
And you could contextualize. So if your dominant category, column A, has the overall a controlled menu that would not stop you from, in a second column, reframe the term relevant to that particular discipline. Like in this discipline, the assessment is called X or Y. So the OSCE would not be it would not reach column A. It would be an exemplification. It will be a contextualization example. So then you'd say you'd have example in particular discipline or cognate area. So then the question of say the OSCE would be, where would it fit? Would it be, could the OSCE be moved to an example of a practicum task, e.g. OSCE? I guess that's a question.
I think it does, and I think there's a level above practicum task, which is demonstration of skill or demonstration of understanding or application of concepts in a new context or reflection. I think that's kind of the higher level that we haven't quite reached yet. Like, I think something like a reflective assessment piece, you're trying to draw out something quite different to recall. I don't know how to organize those, but that feels like a higher order sort of layer.
Yeah.
Rosie just made the point that the task is irrelevant if the criteria aren't right. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, Rosie?
Yeah, sure. I think that actually I had a conversation earlier today with some people from our medicine faculty, and they had a task. It was a reflective case-based task, and the criteria that were being used weren't actually matching what they were asking the students to do, and the scenario that they were trying to design wasn't actually matching, like you weren't able to elicit full marks from the students in it. And so I think we spend a lot of time in our courses going, right, I'm going to have one essay, and then I'm going to have 2 case studies, and then I should have an oral presentation or some sort of group work. So I'll do a group oral because that's easier to mark. And we don't actually map back, for example, those 2 case studies and that one essay, if each of them has 15% on referencing or language usage, that becomes a large percentage of the unit mark that is going towards one particular skill set. And we don't always have a look at what it is that we are actually assessing. We use these tasks as buckets, and then like no one's really controlling or quality checking what's going into those buckets in terms of what we're assessing the students on. And so, a lot of the time when I'm asked to help review or to consult on assessment, I'll actually start by mapping their existing assessments, and they'll find that, 17% of their unit mark is actually going towards punctuation or something, because no one's really mapped across and had a look at what the actual criteria are within those tasks.
I think that's an interesting point. It's related, and something that probably people are familiar with an assessment type, and they then just develop criteria for that assessment type instead of thinking of the purpose. I did want to contribute to thinking about where we want the students to be performing at on the AQF level, because I think that gives us perhaps something that can be shared across institutions and disciplines about the level of cognitive engagement or the level of creativity or individual versus group characterizations of the assessment tasks.
So would you see some types of assessment or some assessment tasks as being, would you see it as a differentiator of that relates to grouping the assessments? Would you see some,
I think, like, Hans, it's more picking up on the Monash example, where you've got essays coming up in lots of the different categories, and you say, what I expect of an essay in first year is going to be more descriptive and relational rather than a critical reflection and analytical, for instance. So it's almost like you have a category, do we agree what an essay is? And then we say that it's likely to have different characteristics at different AQF levels.
Yeah. Would that warrant its own category?
I think so in Australia, because in the higher education and in the ASQA areas, we need to be able to defend that the level of assessment is appropriate for the level of learner.
Mm-hmm. So given that we've got 20, what I was, I mean, this is, I think we're at the core now of the struggle, and I can see why many organizations then keep very long lists. I wonder if there is a grouping possible where the more the umbrella task is in capital letters, and underneath it in lowercase. For example, a reflection piece. Now, a reflection piece seems to me not to warrant an individual, it's a category of its own. So where, you know, and demonstration of skill, are we talking about, it looks to me like that's more related to a physical skill, to the application of a particular ability. It has more of an association of vocational education and training kind of orientation, whereas the analytical and the reflective seems more in the essay category, if essay is a good category.
I think something like a demonstration of skill is something you probably find in medicine. Like, you need to be able to, I'm really bad at coming up with examples, you know, insert a catheter or whatever. Like, that is a very, and yeah, I mean, it's vocational, but it's also, it's just practical.
So it's practical, and maybe a better word, practical skill.
Yeah.
But it's the demonstration of the skill that is the part that is trying to be observed, and whether that's observed live or not, it doesn't particularly matter. It could be an artist dancing.
Yes.
It could.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things.
But there's sometimes resources involved though. Like if I think about you know, science labs, and you have to demonstrate your ability to use certain instruments in a science lab, you have to actually be in that lab to be able to, or in a lab, you know, and it's not always easy to do that from wherever you are.
Yeah, and so I transformed a microbiology course from face-to-face to online 10 years ago, and it was wonderful, all the creative ways that you would ask them to demonstrate it, because the skill of what you're trying to get them to show you, yes, in a laboratory it would look in this very defined way, but you can actually demonstrate that skill in a few different ways at an introductory level. You're not going to go and be a PhD research scientist in microbiology, never having stepped in a science lab, but you can get first year through.
That's true. That's cool. I like that.
So if you're able to edit the sheet and you were to retain some and say, look, some of these are really likely to be are agreed on sort of assessment tasks or types. I'm still not sure about the task versus type. And you would give those, like, which of the assessments would you give an amber color to kind of say, I'm questioning this one? So if you go into the sheet and you go, for example, is the multiple choice question and the match and fill, are they separate categories or can they be grouped? Is a project artifact should that be in capital letters? Should that be a which ones would you imagine could be grouped? For example, if I look at match and fill or MCQ or true false, I would think those are, in my mind, in my experience, I would cluster those together. I would not have a separate row for MCQ. I would have that in the same category as match and fill, multiple choice, true, false. And I would also rate them as relatively low in authenticity and proximity.
Hans, I'm just looking at the clock. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Do you want
yes.
to sort of explain a little bit on how you want to continue this work, or how, if you?
Yeah, let me stop sharing the screen. So this this workshop was interesting. That Colin and I had a discussion about this, and the thought was that the size of the task is multiple workshops in series, and my curiosity was let's find out whether when you've got 20 people who all work in different universities, what they come up with. So my sense is my sense is that you should be able to group them together in I don't know, 7, 8, 9 types. But in order to do that, you do need to do the theorizing that I think has already happened in Monash. But what I'm left, I guess, curious about is your experiences of the discipline specificness of it, and to what extent you encounter as well. What I've encountered in my work is what I call the special little snowflake syndrome, where the categorization, where people argue that there is a difference in their discipline that I'm not always convinced is there. That I think sometimes there's a deliberate sort of exaggeration of differences in order to retain one's autonomy. And because the nature of our work, I often think, is quite anthropological when we cross over from different disciplines, we're in quite a unique position to look at commonality and patterns in the assessment types. And so that's where I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are.
It's a big question. I think when we were initially having the discussion of, sort of a taxonomy, I was thinking in terms of the animal world. So you've got your domain, your kingdom, your phylum, your class, your order. And I think that it is actually possible to break assessment activities down in that many different kinds of levels. And I think we can also consider discipline-specific activities, like OSCEs, for example, are associated with a fairly specific sort of health medical field, but then they're part of a larger thing, which is a practical demonstration, and that's part of a larger thing, which is skills, maybe. So I think this is all entirely doable. It's just a matter of having a very clear idea of what the outcome is. Like, so when you're designing a curriculum, you want to be able to say, okay, so we've got these learning outcomes, and we probably want something from the reflection bucket, and we probably want something where we can actually see them doing this thing in practice, and then we want them to be able to recall certain data, and this is a terrible oversimplification of learning. But I feel like that's kind of a broad starting point.
And I just want to pick up on Tom Worthington and Cheryl's point as well, is that by having the tags to the different types of assessment, it is possible to to do that clustering and to do that data, and then come up with a mapping. Quite similar to, I think, the kind of cluster analysis. For example, I don't know whether you remember this, but 4 years ago there was the seven political tribes of Australia, which the Australian National University had developed in conjunction with a consulting firm, and they managed to use data to cluster and come up with 7 political tribes. And I would think you could do the same here if you have enough of these columns filled in and say this is where the common patterns are. And I'm wondering who's interested in that. So I might follow that up with.
I would propose it to you the other way and say you get 100 assessments from as many different areas as you can, and you classify them, and you start by breaking them into just yes/no categories. Is it a written task? Yes, no. Is it a knowledge task? Yes, no. Is it a practical skill demonstration? Yes, no. And you take your 100 tasks and you see how many different columns you have to go back to, how many different characteristics do you need to be able to differentiate them or cluster them. And you kind of go forwards and backwards on that.
Yeah. And it does sound like different universities are already endeavoring to do so, but have discovered that it's actually not an easy task.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, Hans.
Yes, thank you for your thought-provoking input.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and it's ongoing. Clearly, we didn't come to clear conclusion, which is part of the process. But yeah, can we all thank Hans, please?
Thank you, everybody.